Hello, my name's Gavin, and this is Genre Books, and today I want to talk about Frank Merriwell, but also his creator, Gilbert Patten. When the Summer of Sport reading event came about, I was just going to avoid it. I'm not a sports book reader. I've read The Fight by Norman Mailer, a handful of books on cricket, but my interest in sport, such as it is listening to cricket on the radio, watching the occasional football match, and trying every year to catch as much of the Tour de France as I can. So my knowledge on sports books was really limited. I knew that I wanted to look at sports pulps because I knew that they were a thing and I'd not read them before. Looking into sports pulps, I saw the same name mentioned time and again, either as an influence to the genre, an influence to how those stories are written, but I think also as an aspiration for a lot of writers as to the success that they can enjoy in creating a sports hero out of thin air. Frank Merriwell is too good to be true. He's a phenomenal athlete. This shows itself when he is at school. This is a military school called Fardale, where sporting prowess and extolling the benefits of clean living and moral rectitude all sit cheek by jowl. In the pages of Tip Top Weekly for 20 years, Gilbert Patten, writing under the name Bert L. Standish, gave to the world stories of Frank's sporting prowess and also that of his brother Dick Merriwell and eventually his son Frank Jr. As well as baseball and American football, there's also boxing, hockey, lacrosse, bike racing, golf, billiards, athletics, ice skating. There is literally nothing Frank can't do. He is the captain of the team, whichever team you have going. He is the boy who stands up to the bullies, protecting younger members of the school. He is a person that protects the name of the school. As the stories go on, he solves a surprising number of crimes for a schoolboy. But he does age. Although he ages very slowly, he does age. On leaving Fardale, he goes to Yale. And the pattern of stories repeats itself again. Frank is a sports superstar at university. There are still mysteries to be solved. There are still chaste relationships with the very few female characters to be pursued. The Frank Merriwell stories begin as pure juvenile fiction, but they don't really leave that arena. But they also cater and become slightly more adult to match the aging of the people who read them. When Frank does go to university, in order to keep a line of school sports stories going, we introduce his half-brother, Dick Merriwell, into the equation, who has many of the same sporting qualities, as well as a strange ability to talk to animals given his half Native American upbringing. This is a counterpoint to Frank Merriwell's gift for ventriloquism and throwing his voice. Fandom reacts to this in the way that fandom always does seem to react to things like this. They write letters in and express their opinion that it was better when they were kids. And this must be the fact of a problem with the literature rather than the fact that they are now adults. And speaking of adults, these books seem to have influenced the right people. Clarence E. Mulford, the Western writer and creator of Hopalong Cassidy, cites Standish's Merriwell stories as an influence and perhaps a template for the moral righteousness of characters in his Western stories. In the real world, Babe Ruth spoke glowingly about reading Frank Merriwell when he was a boy, and if it encouraged Babe Ruth to continue with baseball, then that's a real world influence these books have had. Even the then president, Woodrow Wilson, spoke about the influence of the books. Now, given his age compared to the age of the books, I don't know whether he's maybe pandering to an audience there a little bit, but it's entirely possible that he read, enjoyed, and took heart from these works. I've read a couple now myself. I read the second book in the series, Frank Merriwell and His Chums, and I read the 232nd book in the series, which was Frank Merriwell's Diamond Foes. By this point, we're mostly focused on Frank Merriwell Jr., but this goes to show the longevity and the popularity of the character, and in particular the crazy output from Gilbert Patten. Gilbert Patten had 30 days grace given to him by his father when he made the announcement that he wanted to become a writer. If he could make some money in that time, he wouldn't have to go back to the job that he had vacated. He sold 2 stories for $6. The first 2 things he wrote, he managed to sell. So he wrote some more. He wrote To Order, and then got a check for $150 for a dime novel. His father, by this point, has relented and said, yes, you can pursue this goal. And he really did pursue it. Gilbert Patten writes lots of dime novels. He writes about what he knows, and then he goes and finds out something else and writes about that. It doesn't seem to take much to inspire him to write about certain things. Seeing the popularity of westerns, he decides to travel west and get a feel for the area and write on that basis. He gets as far as a particular train station, stays half a day, doesn't like it, and comes home, and yet churns out plenty of westerns after this, what looks like a day trip. Patten, however, has arrived on the dime novel scene just as the dime novel scene is coming off the boil somewhat. It is losing market share to the beginnings of the pulps, certainly the Muncie and the Street and Smith publications, and this reflects itself in the paychecks that come to Patten from writing for Beadles, for example. Patten moves around publishers, but still notices this pattern that these amounts of money from writing are becoming less and less. The final straw for Patten before he moves to Tip Top Weekly is when he got an advance from his current publisher because he needed the money, and instead of the $100 promised to him for the story, they only gave him $90, saying that advancing him the $100 for 10 days cost them $10. And I think at that point he just threw the towel in, but had this offer to write for Tip Top Weekly and to begin writing a different type of story. This was going to be a story about a schoolboy, and he should have a strong name. And reading, especially that second book, Frank Merriwell and His Chums, some of the other things that have been asked to be included, he is very much writing to prescription. There has to be a love interest, but not too much. And there is, but not too much. There have to be rivals at the school, and there are. There has to be some comic relief in some of his chums, and there are, with some, to my mind, the weakest part of the book, a Dutch boy and an Irish boy, and their almost unintelligible accents as they appear on the page. I was prepared not to like the book purely based on this until I found out that these were things that he had actually been asked to include specifically. The formula was laid out for him. But I think what Patten did with that formula surprised everybody. The publisher was thinking a series of 9 or 10 stories, and these are long short stories or novelettes, 20,000 words, and they were thinking, get 10 of those, see how well they've done, move on to something else. But they did exceptionally well. They sold out. And week after week, the Frank Merriwell stories sold out. This puts the strain on the writer to come up with new ideas for the character again and again and extend that franchise, to hit you with a number of figures straight away. These works came out between 1896 and 1916, 986 instalments, 245 novels, 500 million sold. That's the number that grabbed me when I was first reading about this character. For 40 years, Frank Merriwell books outsold the Bible in the United States of America. The Frank Merriwell stories, as written by Gilbert Patten, writing as Bert L. Standish, come to 20 million words. That's 16 Remembrance of Things Pasts. That's 4.5 times the length of the Wheel of Time series. That's a lot of mystery solved, a lot of baseball balls hit. I think if you wanted to read them all, you'd be crazy. I think if you saw those figures and statistics and weren't intrigued to read at least some of it, you'd be incurious. I'm curious, so I did read some. They are fun. The peril, for the most part, is mild. Although towards the end of Frank Merriwell and His Chums, there is something that looks like something more serious might have happened. But the day is saved. This is also a feature. Frank Merriwell comes through. He comes through for his friends, he comes through for his school, and for a boy, a character who is presented as being alone in the world. He has a rich uncle, which is why he's at this military school, but he's lost both his parents. His guidance comes from the school, not the teachers of the school, whom he often circumvents or rebels against, although he does respect them. But the school ethos is almost like he believes that school motto. Modern day companies have these awful things called mission statements, and I'm not sure that anyone pays attention to those. But Frank Merriwell would. The sports are at the same time central to the series but occasionally peripheral to what the story is telling you. There is a lot more about the interpersonal relationships, the vying for becoming the captain of the team, and the problems that that can engender, rather than there is in the actual sporting event that occurs at the end. Fardale Academy playing against any other school is not a do or die proposition, as long as the game is played in the right spirit. On another occasion, playing against a team where there has been betting involved, there is a moral imperative to show up any sharp or underhand practice, but doing that through playing by the rules and playing valiantly. It's a lovely idea, but it really does make very much of a fiction out of this fiction. I'd not heard of Frank Merriwell before. I'd not heard the names Bert L. Standish or Gilbert Patten before. I don't know if this is because it never made the move across the Atlantic, or I don't know whether it is largely unknown about in the States itself. Certainly at the time it had an impact, as the circulation shows. When radio comes along, there is a radio series about Frank Merriwell. He's an adult now, but still solving crimes. In 1936 there is a movie serial. Now I've listened to some of the radio, I've watched some of the movie serial. I enjoyed the movie serial more than I enjoyed the radio. I think the radio is just suffering from the loss of fidelity, but both go to show that the enduring popularity of the character in American culture up until the Second World War. I can't find that post-war there's much mention of the character at all. I would say in 1973 there is a story in Galaxy magazine by Ward Moore where an android who takes the name of Frank Merriwell becomes President of the United States. Not quite sure that's what Gilbert Patten would ever have had in mind for his character, but it showed that there must have been some people reading stuff in the 70s who still had that memory. But I think the greatest influence is a little nebulous in its beginning. There are conflicting reports of who was influencing who, but as well as Gilbert Patten, there is another writer, Edward Stratemeyer, another very prolific writer, and one who goes on to create some series, again juvenile fiction, but ones that pretty much everyone has heard of. Now, one influence that Stratemeyer certainly had on maybe not Patten, but certainly the publishers of Patten's stories, is how these stories end up being presented. Although the Frank Merriwell stories come out in Tip Top Weekly in 20,000 word installments, compiling 3 or 4 of these stories into a hardback book for consumption in libraries and elsewhere, is something that comes from Stratemeyer. Although Stratemeyer ends up being initially banned from a lot of libraries because his books were not deemed as having enough literary merit, Stratemeyer starts with a series called The Rover Boys under the name Arthur M. Winfield. Then, under the name Laura Lee Hope, he starts producing The Bobbsey Twins. Under the name Victor Appleton comes Tom Swift. These books are wildly successful. As I say, some libraries do ban them, but Stratemeyer finds that in areas where his books have been banned by libraries, they're just selling even better in the bookstores. After these initial series, he also makes a decision. Frank Merriwell grew up, went to university and beyond, and his son attended Fardale Academy. The Rover boys grew up, and in later series it's the sons of the Rover boys and the daughters of the Rover boys who are having the adventures. But Stratemeyer makes a decision to preserve these characters in amber going forwards for the new series. New characters will not age. They won't be going off to university or having marriages and children. And this is a tactic that brought him success. Another tactic that brought him success is that at this point he has started the Stratemeyer Syndicate, and he is farming these works out. He is now gone from being a writer to becoming a full-on publishing house. Everything is done under house names. Plenty of other writers are given gainful employment, but the rights all sit with the Stratemeyer Syndicate. Outlines would come from Ernest Stratemeyer, and authors would fulfill their obligation by fleshing these out into full works. And here we come to the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew, and it's a model that stayed popular. It's one that worked. Everyone, I think, has probably heard of the Hardy Boys or Nancy Drew, and the series continue after his death. One of his daughters takes over the firm, and in the end sells this in the late 80s to Simon & Schuster, and the imprints are sort of still going on even today. The same, unfortunately, can't be said for Frank Merriwell. He seems largely forgotten, although I will be happy to hear otherwise. There have been attempts to reprint some of the works, but I think just given the sheer volume of work that there is there, a publisher probably can only realistically, financially, only scratch the surface. Normal pulp service to be resumed shortly. This just seemed an interesting diversion which fulfilled both a sports brief and gave a look at that link between a writer who switched from dime novels to pulp. When Patten died in 1945, his obituaries hailed him as the last of the dime novelists, but I think he's amongst the first of the pulp novelists as well. Back soon with Pulp Digests, and hopefully without the hay fever, at a point soon. Until then,